Good morning, my name is Søren and I'm going to tell you a little bit about backup this time, and backup is chapter 11 lesson 2 in the training kit for the Microsoft exam 70/462. First of all, you must understand the different types of backups, and then there is a lot of things you must understand when you're going to backup mirror databases, replicate databases and so on. But if you understand the basics, then it's quite easy to understand how backup works, and then it's simply just about learning what you're doing. So let's go over to the SQL server. I have a management studio and I have my AdventureWorks database. If I want to back up that without thinking about a backup strategy, then I simply just right click tasks, and I do a backup. This Windows generates a SQL script, so when I'm finished setting up, I can click and script action to new query window. And I recommend you do that because you will probably get a lot of coding questions in the exam, and therefore you need to understand what the graphical user interface are doing. So first of all, you can see that I want to back up the AdventureWorks 2012 database, and I can see that the recovery model of the database is full. That means that basically I'm able of doing transaction log backups. But what we want to do is we want to do a backup of the database, so we want to do a full or differential backup. If you're going to create a backup strategy, then we of course always start with a full backup. You can't take a transaction log backup unless you have a full backup, and let's try to do that. Then we have this copy only, and I'll get back to that a little bit later, but basically it means that you can do a backup without ruining your backup sequence. I want to take a backup of the database, and the backup set should be this. Expires after 0 days, it doesn't matter, and it should be stored at C/backup full 1.back, and that's it. If I click on options, then I can say that I want to append to the existing backup set. That means that every time I do a backup, it will append the file. There's a lot of things about reliability here, so I can verify backup when finished. That could be nice, so I'll click that, and then I could set backup compression. I'll click compress backup. Use the default settings, then it is the default settings that decides if the backup is compressed or not. That's it. So now I could click OK, but what I will do instead is that I will script what I've done here. So I script it to a new window, and I close it, and now you can see a lot of code. This is the verification. So if we just go down here, then we will back up database to disk, and then you have a lot of with clauses. This is a standard backup SQL statement. So we back up a database, we back up to file, and we have these parameters. You must learn these parameters for the exam, or at least some of them, and therefore I recommend that you use books online. It's quite good actually. So what I do is I click a file, and what you can see now is that this is how it is proceeded, and that's actually the stats equal 10. So if I've written 20, then you will see different percentages here. It processed 24,000 pages for the database file AdventureWorks, and please also note it processed 2 pages for the log file. So actually when we're talking about full backup, it's taking a backup of the database file, then that's correct, but it also take a backup of necessary pages from the log file. So backup database successfully processed a lot of pages in approximately 2 seconds. That's it. I can go down to over to my folder, and you can see I have a full backup, and it's only 45 megabyte large. I know the database is around 190 megabytes, so there is a lot of compression. Then we can verify the backup set, and that's a lot of code here, so I'll just mark it. Run. The backup set on file 1 is valid. I think the important part is this statement: restore verify only from disk. I think that's important to learn restore, verify only. This is another way of restoring, and it's just verify only. What I could do is I could write restore header only, and then I will get information about the statement. Let's see if I know how to do that. Only like this, and then I get information about the backups in this file. I think you need to learn for the exam verify only and header only. So now I've done a full backup. What I then can do instead is that I can also take a differential backup, and that means that if imagine that you have a very large database, and on Sunday equal you do a full backup, and then it is, let's say, 250 gigabyte. I'm not sure that's a big database, but it's a lot actually. And then on Monday you want to do a backup again, and you have a lot of changes to the database, so you decide a full backup would be the correct backup type. So you could do that, or you could try to analyze and see how many pages are changed in the database file, and if that's a limited number, then you could on Monday do a differential backup. That would be approximately 10 gigabyte. On Tuesday you could do the same, then it would be 20. Sorry, Tuesday. On Wednesday, it would be 30. A differential backup means that I take a backup of changes since the last full backup. So Monday we have changed 10 gigs of data. On Tuesday we have changed 20 gigs of data since Sunday, and Wednesday we have changed 30 gigs of data since Sunday. When I'm going to restore, if I want to restore here on Tuesday, then now I need to restore the full backup and then the differential backup. How to do a differential backup? It's very easy. I'll go in here and I will first of all do a change in the data. I will change the first address to Sorens. That's it. Close it again, and I will go in and right click AdventureWorks, Tasks, Backup. I'll do it a little bit fast now, Differential, and just for fun I'll write C and backup diff.back. That's it. I click OK, I choose Options, I compress, this time just click OK, and that's it. Now I have a differential backup, and you can see the size is quite much more smaller. The way it works is that in the database file you have what you call a differential map, and this map is taking care of registering what pages are changed. So now I can do a differential backup. What I'll do now is that I also want to do transactional log backups. So imagine that we every day take a backup of the log file, log 1. This is actually a recording saying what has changed since the how can you say it? This is what has changed since the last transactional log backup. So we only get changes. It's difficult to explain. You just take a backup of the transactional log backup, and the log file is used to register the changes that has been made to the database. And the reason is that you can't do a full backup of the database every night, so you need in some way to find a mechanism to make sure that you can recover to point in time. And to recover to point in time, you just need to register the changes, and you do that with the log file. To do that, you need to be in full recovery mode, and you just right click, take task, backup, and this time we do a differential backup. Remove, new, log .cn. That's it. Before I do that, I will try to go in and change one more record. That's it. And now we're ready to do the backup. So that's it. Now we have done 3 different types of backups, and they are described on page 487, and that is actually the main types of backup. You need to learn what a differential backup, full backup is, a differential backup is, and what a transactional log backup is. On page 488 you see that there is also something called files and file group backup, and that is because you can do a backup of, for example, a file group. Imagine that you have a very large database and you have 2 file groups. One is called current data and one is called historical data, and then you can do a file group backup. Let's do that. We create a new database, call it backup test. Go to file groups. We have the primary. I add a new one called secondary. Go up, sorry, here I add a new called file 2. This time I will place it on the secondary, and I just click OK. So now I have a new database. I'll right click, task, I will backup, and this time first of all I will start with a full backup. Just create a new folder. Backup 2. So we will say that we will do a backup to full back. That's it. First we do a full backup. So we've done that now. But now imagine that we have 2 tables. We have a table that is stored on, we just create an ID column, and we store this on the primary file group. We call this current data, and then we create a new table, just have an ID also here, and we store that on the secondary file group. Close that. And we call it historical data. Now imagine that this table is very big, but it's not changed very often. Then it would be nice just to have a backup of the current data. So what we can do now is that we can right click, task, we can do a backup, and then we can remove this one, and we can say that we want a full backup of a file group, and that file group is a primary file group. I click OK, I add, and please note that I could have done, if I change to differential, then it will do a differential backup of these file groups. So you can combine these 2 types, sorry, the full and differential, with the files and file groups. Click here. So I just click OK now. That's it. Let's see what we have. Backup 2. That's it. And you can see we have a full and a primary backup. And of course we have no data, so the size would be equal. And that's it. Now we have done a lot of backup. You have also seen the files and file group backup. If you want to imagine that you have this process where you also have a log file backup, then if suddenly one day a developer comes and say, I want to have here on Tuesday, I want to have a backup of the database, then what will happen is that when you take a full backup, then the differential map is cleared, so that we are ruining our backup sequence if we do a full backup. Therefore, if the developer wants a backup for testing purposes, then we can do what we call a copy only database. I do a backup, I click copy only, I could click at C/backup, copy only, and now I've done a backup. But it has not ruined the backup sequence. So it is possible to take a backup of a database without ruining the sequence. It's called a copy only backup. Well, on page 489 you can see that there is something about backup compression, and what I showed you is that you can use compress, do not compress, or use default settings. If you go to properties and you take database settings, then you can find something called compress backup. If you check that, then the default setting is compress backup. On page 490 you have a description of the recovery models, and recovery models decides which backups you can do, and that means basically if I take the database at VentureWorks, then you can see the recovery model is full, and full means that you can take a transaction log backup and a full backup. And what does that mean? That means actually that you can recover to point in time if possible. The most important thing I think you should remember is that you can do a full or you can do a you can do a transactional log backup. If you set it to simple, then you can't take a transaction log backup, and you can't restore to point in time. And if you set it to bulk log, this is a special kind of recovery model that is focusing on doing bulk transactions, and when you do a bulk transaction, then you have what we call minimal logging. You can't recover to point in time when you are in bulk log mode. So I suggest if you have a critical database where you create data, then use the full recovery model. On page 491 you talk about backing up system databases, or we're talking about backing up system databases, and you can see that the different types of system databases. You have the master database. You should of course do a backup of that regularly. For example, you have your logins and whatever you have stored them in here, and if you lose the master database, then you can't start your SQL server. Then you have the model. It's not necessary to do a lot of backups of that, because the model database is simply a model for creating new databases, and that means that when you create a new database, for example create database test, then it will be a copy of the model database. And I can show that very easily. I create a new table called, just have an ID column, I save it, I call this new TBL, new table, that's it. And now I create a new database called test model new, that's it. I right click and refresh, and then you can see that I have my table that I created in the model database. So basically you only need to do a backup of the model database when you do changes to it. Then we have the MSDB database, and I like this database because it holds a lot of nice information, for example about the SQL Server agent, and you can see it's about log shipping, it's something about backups and jobs running and mail and whatever. So therefore of course you need to take a backup of quite a lot of times. It says you should back up this database whenever you make changes to jobs and alerts. My opinion is that you should put this into the normal backup process, so that you do a backup regularly. Temp database is a very special database because it is recreated every time you restart the SQL server. You can't back up the temp database. Then you have the resource database, and you can't see it here because it's a special internal database, and basically you can't do a backup of that. What you should do perhaps is that you could use a normal Windows backup program so that you can copy the files. Then I have this distribution, and that is because I've set up replication, and of course you should also do a backup of the distribution database. The recovery mode is simple, so you just need to take a database backup. So this is backups of the system database, and you can read about that on page 492. And if you look at the replicated databases, if you have replicated databases, then it says what you need to take a backup of, and that's of course the master, the MSDB, and the publication databases, and master, MSDB, distribution databases, and subscription databases. Well, to start, that's described on page 492, but let me try to tell you what that means. Basically, on the servers that are in the replication, you of course need to take a backup of the master and the MSDB databases. That's of course, but that has nothing to do with that we are going to take a backup of replicated databases. What is interesting is that where you have your distribution, you also need to take a backup of the distribution database, and where you have your publication database, for example, I showed you earlier that you can have a publication of AdventureWorks. There you need to do a backup of the AdventureWorks database, of course, and you of course also need to do a backup of the subscribers if you want that. Basically you can say that you can recreate the subscribers, but it's always better to do a backup because in some situations you might not be able to recreate the subscriber databases. Then you have a backup of mirrored databases, and you of course need to understand what is mirroring. And if you're talking about mirrored databases, then you can only back up the principal database, and that should also be okay. You cannot do a backup log with no recovery. That means you can't take a tail log backup. Then you have always on replicas, and you need to read that on page 493, but it tells you how to back up an always on database. A funny little thing is that on page 494 we talk about checkpoints. I have not heard about that for an exam, but let me try to explain it. That is that everything that you have in the log file, at some point you need to commit that to the database, and the SQL Server does that with the checkpoint statement. Checkpoint statements actually takes all the pages that are held in memory and writes them to the physical database file, and the SQL Server does that approximately one time every minute, but you can be under pressure, so sometimes it can take a little bit longer. You can also change the frequency by alter database and set target recovery time, so that's also very important. Okay, let's continue, and what I want to show now is backup devices. So if you go to server objects, then you can make it a little bit easier for yourself, because you can create backup devices. So I want to create a new backup device called my disk system, and just to make sure that we're not ruining anything, then we'll go here and create a new folder, backup 3. That's it. So write backup 3 folder back. That's it. I click OK. Now I have a backup device. What I can do now is that if I want to do a backup, it should be quite easy to decide if I want to do a backup to a device. So if I want to use a backup device, then I can simply just write it, backup database adventure works 2. Oops, I just moved that in, and that should actually be it. Let's see if that's working. I'll click F5, and I've done a backup. It's quite easy actually. It's not a big deal. It's just something that you need to know for the exam. And then you have the media sets. That's on page 497. A media set can include a single file, multiple file, a tape, or multiple tapes. What's important to realize is a small comment about mirrored backup media sets. You of course need to know that you can do a mirrored backup, so that you have the backup written to multiple, or you can have multiple copies written of a backup. So then you have a lot of descriptions on how to do the backup, and on page 500 you have backup of the transaction log backup. If you do a special kind of a transaction log backup, then it's called a tail log backup, and you do that just before you start restoring a database. That's a tail log backup, and that's because we want to try to catch the changes in the database after the last log backup, but before we want to restore, so that we can recover to point in time. And I think I will show you that a little bit later. You can view the backup history also, but That's simply just very easy. You just go in and find the log, application event log, and then you can filter. But what you also could do is that you can find all the tables in the MSDB database here. So you have a lot of backups, and if you're lucky, then you can find some information about the backup history. Try to select and see what we have here. You can see we have a lot of descriptions, and simply just about trying to learn these tables and what the content are. I think that's about backup.